It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in. It is the Take Command podcast, and surprise, Logan's here. I told you we were going to do a podcast later this week where I was going to figure out what we were doing. What we figured out is we can record one more before Logan goes to this wedding. So, Logan Paulsen, football analyst, welcome back to your own show before you become Logan Paulsen wedding guest.
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate you having me on. Appreciate you not selling the farm on me yet.
Hey, look, I was willing to wake up. Just pull back the curtain. We talk about this sometimes. Sometimes podcasts get better as they go because we record them early in the morning and the caffeine starts to hit as we go. This is a caffeinate as we go podcast. I've woken up earlier than I wanted to on my day off to accommodate Logan because waking up early on my day off was better than doing the podcast without Logan. Not only for you, the audience, but for me. So
for me.
That's
Hopefully
where we're
you get
at.
Nap later. Are you big nap guy, Craig?
I can nap, which drives my wife crazy because she is not a napper. And it's not that she's mad at me for napping. She just wishes she could also nap.
100%.
Are you a nap guy? I feel like most athletes are nap guys.
Dude, I doesn't take anything. I'll just lay down on the couch, fall asleep for 15, then we're ready to rock and roll. So
yeah, it's the best. Just a little reset, a little refresh in the middle of the day. That definitely might be on the agenda later. As for the agenda for this podcast, we're going to talk about the Brandon Aiyuk situation from the Niners and then ultimately the Commanders' perspective because, one's relevant to the other. So we'll talk about that. And then we're going to get into a project that Logan has been working on, the evolution of Dan Quinn's defense from his time in Seattle through his time in Atlanta, and now what we expect it to look like here in Washington. I know Logan's been watching a lot of old tape, so I'm very excited to dive into that with him today. Of course, don't forget, early next week, we will have our positional NFC East division rankings, positional group rankings on the defensive side. So fun stuff coming over the next couple of weeks as we get into the off season. Not even we're past OTA season now. The most off of the seasons. Okay, let's get into it, Logan. Brandon Aiyuk puts out this video the other day on TikTok. He's on FaceTime with Jayden Daniels, and he says, they don't want me. I think even if Jayden Daniels wasn't the quarterback here, this is interesting for Washington. Adam Peters obviously was part of the group that drafted Aiyuk. The receiver room is kind of a mystery box, especially long-term for Washington. Sure. But when you look at it from the San Francisco side first, just to kind of get the state of play there, what are you thinking about if you are what's left in the front office in San Francisco, and if you're Kyle, about how Aiyuk fits, the uniqueness of the piece, how replaceable he is, and kind of where you are in your franchise timeline where you're trying to win a Super Bowl right now, especially while Brock Purdy is on the cheapest rookie contract that exists in the NFL?
Yeah, I mean, I look at Brandon Aiyuk and what he brings, and to me, he is a Kyle Shanahan archetype receiver. He's physical in the run game, which I think is a huge part of that offense there, a huge part of the cultural identity of that position. Jennings is the other guy up there who is just, he just spits nails like that. That's something they really value in their receivers. I think he runs excellent routes. I think he's matured in that way tremendously. And I think he has the ability to be a big play guy. And I think as a receiver, he is very undervalued. I think it took him probably 2 years to kind of develop into the player he is now. And I think there's a lot of people in the national media that kind of look back on him as the guy that he was when he was drafted. And he's not, man. He's a very polished receiver. He's a big part of that offense. And to me, I would do a lot to try and keep him there, and that extends to kind of getting rid of Deebo Samuels. You know what I'm saying? I think he's the piece you want to keep. And I think I would do a lot to make sure that happens. And again, they go out and they drafted Ricky Pearsall in the first round, who is a tremendous receiver. I loved his film coming out. I think he's going to, again, talk about just a Kyle receiver. That's what it looks like. And I think you've given yourself a nice contingency. But to me, I would keep Brandon Aiyuk. That's what I would try to do. 100%, full stop.
Yeah, they are in an interesting cap situation because to this point, they have just continued to pay people, which is how you remain good at that level is you have good players and you continue to keep them and you find ways to make the money work. That includes Deebo Samuel, who they just signed to an extension, $28 million this year, $24 million next year. Aiyuk obviously is under contract this year. He didn't report to any of the offseason stuff, etc. But he is an unrestricted free agent, slated to be after this year. He's 26 years old. Jawan Jennings, and then Chris Conley, Danny Gray, like on down the list. Obviously, Pearsall has to sign his rookie deal. That's kind of their receiver room moving forward. But they've got Kittle under contract for $12 million this year, $21 million next year. Seems like he could, they've got void years after that, and option years, but it feels like that could be a restructure situation for Kittle. Trent is paid through 2026 at ridiculously high numbers, which makes sense because he's ridiculously good. But this is age 36 season. He's going to make $31 million. He makes $34 million next year and $37.7 in 2026. So it's not like they have a blank cap moving forward. Nick Bosa got paid. His big number starts to hit in 2026. It's 42 and then 52 in 26 and 27. Warner is 29 next year, 26 the year after. So like, I hear you. If I were them, I'd also want to desperately keep Brandon Aiyuk because who he is as a football player is a vertical deep threat who takes the top off your defense. That is essential to a lot of what Kyle wants to do offensively. The ability to run the football, like to keep to punish safeties for coming down in the box because they need to be helping over the top on a guy like Aiyuk. And like you said, the physicality in the run game, there's not 5 receivers in football that are better than him. Certainly no like two-way receiver, if you will. There's not 5 better than him in football. You got to pay Purdy in a couple of years. He's got 2 more years left at 1 and 1-1. But and then McCaffrey is extended out 4 years as well. I just kind of think in the NFL, you can always make the money work. Like you can always figure it out. There's always ways you can move money around. Like, is Trent actually going to play 3 more years? Like, if I was him, I would put that much money on the contract.
Sure.
But like, there's always ways to move the money around. And if I'm San Francisco, I just find a way to move the money around. And even if I have to trade Deebo after the year, and maybe that's the way I make it work, and for 1 year I take the hit, I'm in too rich of a Super Bowl window. These opportunities are too rare, and Aiyuk is too good and too young to let go.
Yeah, and I think he just gives a little bit more diversity to the offense. And again, I think Deebo Samuel is a good player, but he's a very niche player. And the thing he's good at is excellent. He's kind of got this running back build. Everyone talks about that. But his ability to kind of run these slip screens and maximize yardage after the catch is extremely important. But I think Brandon Aiyuk gives you something similar while also being able to win consistently versus man-to-man coverage. And you mentioned the vertical deep threat. Now, I don't know what his personal relationships look like in the building, and maybe it would probably be hard for me to imagine that they're frustrated with him in any way, but I do think like maybe that's part of this. But I think, like, to your point, they're going to find a way to make the money work. You can, restructure Trent's contract, sounds like pretty easily. You can restructure Kittle's contract, sounds like pretty easily. I think you can find, 28 million, 30 million bucks floating around in there because you haven't paid the quarterback yet. And again, if that means you're moving on from Deebo, like, these are the types of hard decisions good football teams need to make. I think look at the Cincinnati Bengals, right? They're kind of having a hard time with Boyd. He left in free agency. They're trying to figure out what to do with T. Higgins. Like, this is part of it. This is part of what makes good teams. I just think if I was them, based on the film, again, I don't have any personal insight on like what's going on in the building. The film, I would say I would lean towards Aiyuk at this point. And again, like, he's coming off of one of his most, impressive year as a pro. So, maybe that's biasing my assessment a little bit, but I just feel like in terms of what they do in the offense, he's the guy that you want to keep around. And again, if Washington, has an opportunity to go get him, I'd definitely be kicking the tires on that for sure.
So let's go down that rabbit hole. Let's say for whatever reason, like, they can't come to an agreement, things get nasty and they're just like, all right, well, let's see what's out there, because they have apparently at least received calls. The Steelers, amongst other teams, were poking around draft time. Ultimately, they hang on to him. And we both think that they probably should long term. But if you're Washington, currently your receiver room looks like Terry for the next 2 years at not ridiculous, but expensive number. Jahan, you got 2 years to figure out, or you really have a year to figure out what the hell he is, because you have a 5th-year option decision to make after this season. So you could have 2 years left at okay money, like great money this year, solid money next year. Those 5th-year options aren't cheap if you ultimately decide to exercise it. Well, I guess no, he's got 2 years left because they've got
would be his 3rd year, right?
Yeah. So they figure it out. Next year is the 4th year, then the 5th year after that. So you got 2 years left of Jahan at least, if not 3. And then there's Luke McCaffrey, and then there's nothing. In terms of long-term commitments in the receiver room. You also have this window because you just drafted a quarterback at 2, and you have almost no money committed on the roster elsewhere. Like, it's crazy. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not some coming. Sam Cosmi is going to be a enormous extension. He's one of the best guards in football. And at this point, that is no longer a cheap position. So there are some big contracts that are coming due. But I do think you're kind of at a point where if you're Washington, you have to decide, and you have to kind of self-scout. You have to make a determination of how good you think Jayden Daniels can be, how quickly. And if you think Jayden Daniels can be good right now, I'd be calling San Francisco, and I'd give up. I'm not trying to give up a ton of draft capital. I probably don't want to give up a 1. But if I can give up a 2 and get Aiyuk, I'm actually not concerned about the money. I think that's my ultimate takeaway is like, I'm more concerned if I'm Washington with where my current roster is about the draft capital that I'd have to give up and what I'd have to give up, or potentially even a player. Like, do I have to give up Jahan to get Aiyuk? And I don't know that San Francisco does that. Versus do I have room to pay him? Because the answer on the do I have room to pay him is yeah. I'm not paying him any longer than Jayden Daniels' contract is, because I have 5 years of Jayden Daniels, and I'm not giving Aiyuk a 6-year deal.
No, I'm with you. I think if you wanted to go get him, you probably could. I think the prohibitive fact is that it just seems like it's kind of counter to what they did this entire offseason. And I think when you're team building, it's important to consider that, like, you kind of go through phases, right? You got to kind of see, like, what Cliff Kingsbury offense looks like with Jayden Daniels at the helm. You got to think about what Joe Witt Jr.'s defense looks like before you kind of go out and make some of these big free agent signings. And I think, like, maybe there's a little bit of conservatism, by the front office here to kind of say, hey, let's pump the brakes. Let's see if we actually need a player like this with this skill set, because maybe we need someone with a different skill set. While Aiyuk is an excellent football player, maybe this doesn't fit exactly what we want. Like Kyle's offense, that West Coast outside zone. I know they're getting to more gap scheme stuff now, heavy play action stuff. It's looking for a different type of player. And I'm not saying Brandon Aiyuk couldn't adjust to the system, but maybe you don't need that big, like that big payday outside just yet. And again, like, that's part of what this process is early on. So maybe in order to kind of prevent yourself from making a bad decision, and again, I don't think signing Aiyuk would be a bad decision. It just might not be the right fit. And I do want to point out that I do think the staff and the front office here have done a great job of finding fit guys, like through the draft, through free agency. Everybody's been the right kind of fit for the offense and for the defense. I just don't know if, allocating all this money to Brandon Aiyuk and him not being the perfect fit might not be the best way to go about it. But I do agree, like, if the money standpoint should not be overly prohibitive, I think it's the other stuff, the schematic fit. And I think if there's any type of draft capital associated with this, I think you got to be really careful, because I think when you look at Adam Peters and what's made him successful is he's done a good job of basically saying, like, we're going to build through the draft. We're going to build through the draft. That becomes really hard if you're giving away those pieces you want to build with moving forward. And again, there's precedence of, I think the Tennessee Titans trading away A.J. Brown to Philadelphia for a first-round pick. That's a great example here of what this might look like in terms of contract extension, the draft capital required. And I think it'd be very reasonable. However, Philly had 2 first-round draft picks that year, and they were able to kind of, one was a flex pick, and Washington if I'm correct, is not in that same situation.
No, they're not, and they're also not in the same point in their progression that Philadelphia was, whereas like Philly was ready to win right now. The two other, the familiarity factor is the one that I think is interesting too here, because like, you know, when T. Higgins' name would come up, and I would be like, why would you do this? Like, if you trade for T. Higgins, all you're doing is putting yourself in the same situation that the Bengals are getting themselves out of with T. Higgins, where they paid Jamar Chase and they can't afford to pay multiple guys. And when you start to look at the cap sheet, like, I don't know. I just think, I think Ayuk's a better player. Two, I know that this general manager knows him because Peters drafted him. And so when it comes down to that evaluation, like, it's pretty easy for Adam Peters. He knows whether Brandon Aiyuk fits in this plan because he knows Brandon Aiyuk as well as anybody. And I think of the new episode of Commander's Log where they talked about the gold stars or the gold tag, the Commander's tag that they put on draft prospects, and like, they play the way we want to play and all that kind of stuff. And I feel like Brandon Aiyuk would be one of those guys if they did that for free agents or potential trade targets. Like, he'd earned that. But maybe there is a skill set mismatch from a schematic standpoint. And Adam Peters, I trust to know that. I think the last part of it is, circling all the way back to the top here, is the guy who was on the other end of the FaceTime. And what value do you put on bringing your franchise quarterback's best friend in, who he's played with before? And that, I honestly have no idea, because I could see that as a positive. I could see that as a negative. I could see that as, hey, we got him even more comfortable. But I could also see it as, hey, he's already comfortable. We don't want to feel like we're bending the organization to him, even if it's like a solid football move. And like, we want to maintain the professional environment versus like someone who he's buddy with. Now, I think Jayden's personality, I'm actually not that concerned about that at all. I'm just laying out the swath of possibilities, the range of considerations. But I do think that familiarity factor, both from Adam of being confident in whatever he does with this because he knows Aiyuk, and what familiarity and comfort that brings Jayden, is a factor here that probably boosts Aiyuk's value for Washington. Although I don't know if it changes where I ultimately come down once we do the math. I agree with you that I would be very, very hesitant to give up anything major from a draft capital standpoint.
And just to be clear, that's not an indictment of Aiyuk as a player. It's just like, I don't know if it fits the philosophy.
If I was another team, I wouldn't think twice about it. Just this one's early on in a rebuild.
Yeah, I think that's why like those draft capital picks, those draft pieces become really significant, because when you're trying to rebuild. But I do think the Jayden Daniels thing is interesting. Those relationships, obviously, on a football team are extremely important. I don't know how to weigh it because, I'm not in the building, and obviously neither are you. So I don't see it as being a bad thing. But, maybe when you're doing your scouting process, you realize, maybe there's an issue somewhere along the line. I have no idea, but overall, I think it'd be kind of positive. But again, you never know. You never know. Like being on this side of the table, basically this side of the wall. Like you never know what those relationships actually look like. You never know how they interact together. You never know what that'll do to the locker room. And so maybe that's another thing you're a little reluctant about. But ultimately, I think he's a great football player, Brandon Aiyuk. I think he would help the football team. It's just the price tag, what that looks like, and ultimately what Adam Peters decides to do.
Yeah, I think, this is a credit to Jayden in general. Like, I think if you were to bring in one of Jayden Daniels' friends, he ingratiates him into the group. That seems to be the kind of personality that Jayden is. He brings people together. So that to me, like, ultimately, my best guess is it would be incredibly positive. But you just, that doesn't change the timeline of where Washington is from a roster building standpoint. My only question would really be then, like, did they see enough from Jayden Daniels in minicamp where they were like, oh my God, we're ready to be good. Let's extend this window of competitiveness on the rookie quarterback timeline and make a move. And if they did, that's a big bet on minicamp or on OTAs. But that's why they get paid all that money.
That's a great point.
That's why they get paid all that money. But ultimately, I think I come down where you are, which is I want to see it in games. And maybe if at the deadline, Jayden Daniels is bald the first half of the year and Aiyuk still didn't get a contract this summer and like things have fallen apart. Maybe someone gets hurt and like San Francisco is just not going to make the run this year and you can acquire him at the deadline and you're 5 and whatever, like you're 5-4 and like you're in the thick of it in the NFC East and Jayden is ascending. Like, let's make a deal then. I'm at that point, draft capital's on the table for me. And I'll extend Aiyuk, and I have no problem with it. But I do think that there's no immediate rush to do anything right now. Let's see how the season plays out. But it is something that I would say the biggest takeaway that fans can take is from a cap standpoint, because Washington's books are so ridiculously clear for the next bunch of years, they can actually afford to do this in a way that you would not think, considering the resources they have put into that receiver room already.
No, I think that's a great point. I think, time is your friend here. Like the schedule of the NFL season is your friend. Take advantage of it. I didn't even think about that. That's a great point. And I'll say it again. Jayden Daniels, good football player. Brandon Aiyuk, good football player. I want good football players on my team. It just doesn't fit the collective vision of the restructure and the timeline that they're looking at. So that's my only hang up with it, honestly.
All right, Logan, to your project, to your homework, to your capstone here. It's not your capstone. You're not going anywhere unless we consider the rest of your Take Command career, your graduate school. Anyway, the point is, you've been studying Dan Quinn's defense and the evolution of it from his days back in Seattle, where it was this cover three, change the NFL, the way they ran it. It was you know what we're going to do. We're just so good at it that it doesn't matter defense. To a bit more variety and a defense that now seems to be defined by an amoeba-like nature. It's really hard to decipher what they're doing.
Sure.
They move guys around. It's almost the antithesis in a lot of ways. It's a 180 from what they were in Seattle, where you knew exactly where everyone was going to be and there was nothing you can do to stop it. In Dallas, for a lot of weeks, you didn't know where anybody was going to be, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. Why did you want to embark on this project, and what are some of like the highest level takeaways that we can dive into in more detail, but the highest level takeaways from what you learned from watching all this tape?
Yeah, I think it's just cool to see how the NFL changes. Like it started kind of like looking at what happened right before Dan Quinn was really that defense kind of took off, and just why things change, how the NFL, specifically offensive coordinators, are able to adjust and attack defenses and get you out of stuff that you really like and are able to dictate to you, and then you're able to kind of dictate to them for a little bit, and then the kind of the cyclical nature of it, and how ultimately, like, Dan settled on what he did in Dallas, which I think is really smart. And then, I think by extension, Joe Witt and what he's going to be bringing here. So really, like, it kind of stemmed off of, honestly, the Cliff Kingsbury air raid thing, because I think it provided a lot of context kind of schematically to like his offensive vision and perspective. And so I wanted to kind of just go, because, I played for Dan for a year and a half when I was in Atlanta. And, like that was interesting to watch him try to transition there, and then kind of to see what it ultimately became in Dallas was pretty fascinating. So yeah, that's really what was the genesis of it, and excited to get talking about it. Yeah,
for sure. So was there a specific set of plays or concepts that as you're watching Cliff and you're noticing how the defenses are reacting, you're like, oh, this is really interesting. How did we get here?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. The thing I'll start with is back when I first got in leagues, 2010 to 2013, the defense that was in vogue was this Tampa 2 coverage. Tampa Bay is running it, the Chicago Bears are running it, and it was the problem defense for a long time. Miami, the
the Tony Dungy, Lovie Smith, that crew.
Right. So in Tampa 2 is just cover 2, and they've got a Mike linebacker running down the middle of the field. You're playing a 4-man front. You're playing a 7-man box. And so I remember kind of going through that process of being how do you break this? And one of the things that Kyle was really good at was if they're going to play a 6 technique. So basically, if the defensive end is head up on the tight end, they're letting you their contained player is a corner. So why don't we just run outside zone? And because of the positioning of the front, the angles are really good for it. And if you got a good blocking tight end, or if you're creative with the motions and the shifts, you can really get good angles there. And so basically you can run them out of cover 2, because it's predominantly a coverage first. It's a pass coverage first, right? And so if you think about it, there's really nowhere to go with the ball. You've got these 2 corners in the flats, you've got these 2 half safeties, you got this Mike run in the middle of the field. The problem is with Tampa 2, I just mentioned the run thing, is you need to make sure you have the right personnel for it. So I always think of Brian Urlacher as this Mike linebacker that's big enough to kind of stop runs, but also fast enough to carry number 3 vertical down the field. And those guys just don't grow on trees. So how do you solve that? How do you kind of problem solve that situation. So first off, I think the most important thing, at least at this junction of the NFL, was like, how do we stop the run? So let's go from a 7-man box to an 8-man box. To do that, what coverage structure can we play? You got to play cover 3. What's the problem with cover 3 is the seams are wide open. Seams and hitches they kill cover 3. So how do we problem solve that? So first off, we're going to make sure the outside zone's been killing us, right? Killing defenses just in general. Now we're going to have an overhang strong. We're going to have an overhang weak. And by overhang, I mean you're going to have a 9 technique. So someone who's kind of standing outside the running surface of the offensive formation. So if I'm the tight end, you've probably got a 5 technique, so someone just inside of you, and you've got someone just outside of you. So what have we done? We've eliminated frontside combinations and made it really hard to get to angles on the second level, because now Cam Chancellor is basically playing like a linebacker on the weak side of this formation. So great. You're going to play an 8-man box. Let's throw the football. Let's attack the seams. But what they did, which I thought was really good, is they got really physical. They kind of morphed cover 3 into this Seattle cover 3, where they said, well, we have, Earl Thomas, who's one of the best post safeties in NFL history, in my opinion. Like, just his ability to cover grass and read concepts was incredibly high. So let's just make sure we funnel any seam approximately to him, right? So we're going to, that outside leverage player is going to wall the tight end down. Cam Chancellor's going to physically reroute that slot receiver, and we're just going to basically give Earl Thomas time and distance to make any play he wants. We're going to find some big corners who don't have to play man coverage, who can be physical on the edge and carry anything vertical. And we're okay with you throwing hitches, and we can live with that. And so ultimately, I think that was the progression, and it was really awesome. But I think the important thing, even with the Tampa 2 stuff, you need the horses to run it. Right? You need that middle linebacker. I remember, so when I was at UCLA, they were running a version of Tampa 2. And this was 2 years before I got there. And they had one of the biggest, most physical college defensive lines I'd ever seen. They had the Ball brothers. They had Rodney Leslie, guys that played in the league for a long time. But at defensive end, the Ball brothers I think they were 6'7", like 285 type body types. So it's like, good luck comboing them. We're just going to be big and physical. So, and obviously not everybody can find those pieces. So What do? We transition to this cover 3, and Seattle just ran it so well. And I think the beautiful thing about the Tampa 2 teams, about the Seattle cover 3 teams, is they, to your point, which you started this conversation off with, we're basically like, we are so good at this coverage. All the traditional cover 3 beaters, we know what they are. So we're going to make sure you can't get to them, right? You can't run the football. You're going to be in 3rd and 8. We're going to run our cover 3. Earl Thomas is going to make a big hit on a seam player, and we're going to live to fight another day. And that's essentially what they did the entire time there. Now, to make it go, they needed other pieces too. They needed an excellent defensive line. You talk about these tremendous pass rushers, and it wasn't just 4 guys. That's the first team I remember being like, we've got 4 dudes, and we've got another 4 dudes. So you think you've got us like figured out? Here's 8 pass rush bodies that we feel really good about. So that to me was what happened in Seattle. And then obviously there's a transition out of that to as that starts disseminating around the league. I think you see some of the shortcomings that are associated with that defense.
Right. So just to kind of click on that defense before we get to the next evolution. You had obviously Sherman and Browner. Browner ultimately played himself out of the league because he couldn't stop committing penalties. But like at the peak of that defense, when before he started getting flagged for everything, like super physical. Obviously, Richard Sherman is borderline Hall of Fame type of player with how good he turned out to be. But he was a very specific, like former wide receiver at Stanford, turned corner, great ball skills. Not the fastest, but because he was in that cover 3 off zone, he wasn't having to play a bunch of press man. He give him enough of a head start and let him run with guys as opposed to having to do it from a man situation. You don't need a 4-3 corner at that point. And he was so long that he could be in a bit of a trail and still make plays. I think they communicated really well. Obviously, Earl Thomas, his ability to cover grass, like makes that whole thing go. But then there's some underrated pieces like, Cam Chancellor, obviously, is the big hitter that really is kind of the first iteration of Dan's hybrid safety linebacker.
Sure.
So Cam Chancellor, super essential. I mean, the communication in the middle from Bobby Wagner, he's a young player at that point, but that is the legend of Bobby Wagner starting right there. KJ Wright was really important to those defenses.
Great.
The other
Glad you brought him
linebacker,
up.
his
Yeah.
ability to cover and to hit. And like you mentioned, the one through line through the dominant defenses of Dan Quinn throughout the years. And I think something that hurt him tremendously in Atlanta, because this has been plaguing the Falcons franchise through multiple head coaches, multiple defensive coordinators, and multiple decades at this point, is they haven't had a good pass rusher in years. They've tried.
Yeah.
They've drafted guys like Vic Beasley in the top 10, and he just hasn't turned out to be that premier guy. But any defense is going to work better if you get pressure on the quarterback. And it's very clear as a former D lineman and D line coach that Dan understands that. And he has, in Dallas and in Seattle, had excellent pass rushes that have married well with the coverages that they've played. And you take kind of this ball hawking, good ball skills, defensive backs, ability to jump and anticipate routes because you can trust the D-line approach. And no matter what the coverage structure is, that's going to be successful in creating turnovers and being a good defense, because like that's the formula. That's scheme agnostic. From an approach, from a principled standpoint. Let's get a good pass rush and make sure we take advantage of it. That's going to work anywhere. And then it's about, I think, fitting it to your personnel, like what coverage structure is best for us. And obviously, as we just talked about in Seattle, it was perfect for that cover 3.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something I'm really glad you brought up, is like not only was the defense incredibly simple, but it also allowed guys to play really fast, but the talent there. Like I know, like there's like we talk about Earl Thomas, but like Richard Sherman, you mentioned, like the linebackers were perfect. The defensive line each had their individual roles. They had good pass rushers inside as well. And so I think when you look at then the next step of this defensive evolution is it starts disseminating around the league like everything does, right? And everyone's trying to run Seattle cover 3. I remember Jacksonville did it for a while. Excuse me. And a lot of other teams that kind of took pieces from Seattle on the defensive side of the football. I think San Diego at the time also kind of ran some variations. There was probably like 6 or 7 teams, and it became like the standard defense, much like the Tampa 2. The problem when it becomes a standard defense is every NFL coach in the league just basically says, we'll figure out how to kill it. We'll figure out how to kill it. And so that's what they did. And they found all of these different concepts, these different formations, these different play designs, and they just started running that thing ragged. And I think another reason that the cover 3 system, or the Seattle 3 system, started really struggling is because not only was every coach in the NFL trying to break it, you just didn't have the pieces, right? You didn't have that post safety that could cover 40 yards of grass in the middle of the field like it was nothing. I remember watching, we were getting ready for the playoff game in 2012, and I remember watching Earl Thomas, who, when this is nerdy stuff, but when you're watching film of Seattle on the All-22, there were times where he would be off the screen, which is about 20 to 25 yards of grass from ball to him. And I remember watching him break up a slant to the wide side of the field. Like, that dude was an absolute animal in terms of covering grass. And so you lose that piece in addition to the big physical corners outside, and you lose the Cam Chancellor in the middle of the field who can kind of reroute and be this kind of surefire tackle. This guy's getting the ball out, and they just fall apart. And so defenses kind of had to be like, okay, well, what do we do now? And so you started seeing the offenses kind of caught up. The defense is like, what do we do? And everybody kind of went a different direction. Some Seattle cover 3 guys stay Seattle cover 3. And I think kind of to their detriment, honestly, right? And I think other Seattle cover 3 guys like Dan were like, hey, man, this isn't working anymore. Like, offenses are too smart. Our pass rush isn't good enough. Our post safety is a good player, but he can't get it done in Atlanta. So what did he try to do? He tried to play a little bit more man coverage, and he tried to be more aggressive with his pressure packages. And the problem was he kind of made that. I remember I was there for it. He tried to make that switch kind of middle of the season. And so you had this whole personnel profile that was like representative of like what he wanted cover 3 to be. And it just didn't fit this new kind of philosophy. And it hurt him. Like, I think the defense was a little bit more effective, but guys weren't comfortable. They were learning something new. And ultimately, Dan gets fired that year. And the thing that I love about that offseason is because a lot of people would just say, okay, well, how do I go back to what I'm really good at and make this thing go? Like, make it work for me, and kind of say, like, this is the girl. This is the horse that brung me. I'm going to make this thing work. And he totally, I don't say totally reinvents himself, but finds a really nice wrinkle that I think is pretty cool. We'll talk about that when he gets to Dallas.
Yeah. I mean, I think Dan is, it's no secret that I really enjoy Dan. Obviously, you play for him and have a personal relationship there, and really enjoy him as well. But I've said this before, I think on this pod, but I've certainly said it on the radio show and to people like in one-on-one conversations, is I have to be careful with DQ because when I'm trying to give analysis to be objective, because from a high-level standpoint, he just believes a lot of things that I believe. And so it can become confirmation bias. Like some of his favorite sayings are things that I have said before Dan Quinn ever entered my life as a constant presence, doing the jobs that I do. You know, when he talks about keeping the main thing, and things like that, like these pet sayings and kind of the principles of who you are and what you're about, these are things that I believe work. And so I have to check myself because it becomes confirmation bias. But I think one of the things that Dan, I don't know whether he's ever heard this phrase or not, but one of the things that Dan certainly believes in is a phrase that we talk about all the time on Train with the Best that I learned from Chris, which is methods are many, principles are few, methods don't always last, principles always do. And what it means is like there are certain things that are those non-negotiables, and figuring out like what are the things that stretch over time versus the methods of how you actually go about executing them. And when I think about the principles of what DQ seems to have learned over the years is the pass rush, is the ball hawking, is like certain non-negotiables that are the through lines of how he bends the defense from a method standpoint of different coverage structures, different fronts, like how you go about achieving those goals is going to bend and change. But he certainly seems to have both, I think, probably discovered what his principles are, discovered what his things are that are non-negotiable, and then held on to them. And the ability to understand which things are principles and which things are methods are really, really important for a coach, especially a coach in his position where you're designing scheme. Because you have to understand, like, is the important thing here the cover three? Like, is this coverage structure actually the best thing and I need to hold on to that and figure out how to make it work? Or is it something we're accomplishing via cover three and that it's, how to fit things to my personnel or how to create turnovers or how to shut down what offenses are currently doing in the moment? And like his clarity on that by the time he got to Dallas, I think was really, really good. And perhaps in Atlanta, there's a million things that went wrong for you guys in Atlanta and for him in Atlanta in terms of, personnel not necessarily working out, some cap situations that weren't necessarily managed the best. Sometimes you just miss 100%. On players. But that I think I really admire Dan's ability to have that clarity and carry it through to Dallas. And obviously we're very much hoping that it carries through to DC. So that brings us to Dallas.
Yeah. And I think the thing about, so ultimately, what is the underlying issue with cover three at this point in the NFL? It's not that cover three is a bad coverage. People still run cover three. They run different variations of it. As long as you can kind of protect the seams, like it's a fine coverage. It allows you to be +1 in the run game. It's a great coverage structure. I think the thing is that it was so prolific and it was so kind of like, think about it in Seattle. They were running cover three post safety about 80% of the time. Like that's a huge percentage. So what that is doing at some point is it's allowing the offense to play fast. Because basically I know that I don't have to think about anything. I know you are in this coverage. So how do I run my route to beat cover three? And so it was always very liberating as an offensive player playing these cover three teams because you're like, oh, it's Seattle 3. Like I know exactly what to do. Like these are my run calls. These are my routes. This is how I'm going to win. This is what this guy's going to do. And I'm going to see that. I'm not have to think about anything else. They're not even going to play any man coverage. So, and again, that worked for Seattle. But what I think Dan realized is that like you need to, as much as it's important that you play fast defensively, right? And that's what the simplicity of cover three did, allowed those guys to play crazy fast on the techniques. You need to provide some consternation for the offense. And so what comes out of it is you get like kind of him playing a little bit more man, a little bit more match, however you want to characterize that, but a little bit more aggressive coverage structure, coupled with aggressive third down blitz packages that stem to cover 3, stem to Tampa 2. And he keeps cover 3 in there, but he gets back to Tampa 2 pretty significantly, right? Like when, you remember we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, how like that was like the thing before the league kind of transitioned to cover 3. So he said, I'm just going to transition back to cover 3 to Tampa 2. And the thing that I loved about watching it is the principles of the Seattle team are still there, right? We want fast guys with position flex. And again, that's something that he cultivated over his time, probably a little bit of his time away. Like when he came to Dallas, that was something he really leaned into. But I think you brought up a really good point there with Cam Chancellor. It's like, he's a position flex guy. Bruce Irving was also a position flex guy. He played Sam linebacker, but was also a rush end. Is he a big? Is he a little? Right? And I think that kind of got magnified over this time. And you get to Dallas and you say, okay, how do we maximize our pass rush? Let's make it unclear who the rushers are. How do we maximize our coverage? We're going to still play simple coverage structures. We're going to run 3 or 4 of them. We're going to own the heck out of those. And we're going to be able to disguise our man so it looks like cover 3, our man so it looks like Tampa 2, and we're going to be able to get to whatever we need to. And it's going to be able to cause the quarterback for the opposing team to hold the ball longer than we want, let the rush get in there, and let our defensive backs make plays on the football. And I think that was really cool to see, because the principle of Tampa 2 is the same as the cover 3, right? We want to be sound versus pass concepts, right? The principles of the man match, it's just a changeup, right? It's just something like, hey, here's this coverage structure that keeps everything in front of you. Good luck competing a pass. But if I know it's Tampa 2, hell yeah, I can complete a pass. But it just takes the quarterback and basically says, I don't know that it's Tampa 2. I don't know that it's cover 3. I don't know that it's man match. And it gives you a moment consternation and that pressure, which again, I credit to him too. Like the pressure package evolved tremendously. Like the third down stuff they do is really fun to watch. Like we got guys mugged up in the A gap. It looks a little bit like Zimmer's old double A gap rushes and stuff. I know everybody runs that now, but like that became a big part of what they're doing. And I just think it's the same core principles. Good pass rush, simple coverage structures, let guys play fast. But we're getting to it with like the illusion of complexity, much like Kyle Shanahan would do offensively, right? It's like, here's our 4 pass concepts. We're going to run them out of 20 different formations. Good luck trying to figure out what's going on, right? And I think ultimately that's what he's gotten to here in Dallas. But the underlying current is the same.
Simple for us, hard for you. That's the goal,
right?
In football,
right.
Schematically on either side of the ball. And, you know, as we talked about last year, part of the problem was for the defense was it was hard for us, easy for you. And that's why the statistics were at the bottom of all of the categories. So I love that. I think it's really cool. One question I have to wrap up here is when we bring Joe into this, obviously Joe's been around Dan for a long time. In order to do this well, to have this mix, to have it be unpredictable, to have your team, though, still feel like you're in a rhythm, you have to call it well.
Yeah.
What role does, like, obviously Joe is doing, you know, a version of this. Dan's in the room. Like, they're all working together on the field in the teaching spaces to make sure that these guys know it on a high level. But ultimately, the big challenge one of the big challenges for Joe Witt as a first-time DC is going to be in the game. Do I call the right thing at the right time? Was there anything from a play calling, sequencing, whatever kind of lens that you think is significant to point out that Joe Witt's going to have to make sure that he's on top of? Or is the general variety actually make this kind of easy to call? And not that you could like throw darts at a board and pick whichever one the dart lands on, but that it's not as it's actually like how, I guess the simplified version of the question is, how important is the actual play calling of this versus just making sure the options are well taught?
I mean, obviously, I think the options being well taught is the most important thing, because if it's well taught and the guys know what to do, like I could call anything and they're gonna make me right. Now I can maximize them right by kind of this dart at a dartboard type of situation. And I think again, I got to give Dan credit here. At least when you watch games in Dallas, like when they're in their bag, he's calling games and he knows when, hey, they're getting a feel. Let's throw this out there. And then all of a sudden, oh, we get a sack or we get a turnover, whatever it is. And so that's a credit to the guys. It's a credit to the play caller. But I think, again, that's something Joe, any first-time play caller is going to have to do it. And the other thing I want to just point out here, another reason I did this project is because, like, I think about it from an offensive perspective too. So, like, I look at Kyle, right? And he's kind of the architect of this resurgence of West Coast offense or whatever. I don't know how you want to characterize that. But, Sean's from his tree, quote unquote, Mike McDaniels, Matt LaFleur, and all of those offenses are the skeleton is the West Coast under Kyle Shanahan, but it's evolved. It's like they've become like Darwinian. They've become like different birds with different beak lengths. Like they're kind of the same, but kind of different, right? And I think like that's what I'm excited to see here from Joe Witt is like, how does he make it his? Right? Because maybe he doesn't like the randomness of it. Maybe he wants something a little bit more specific. But I think that if he abides by the tenets, right, which is what you talked about, right, the pass rush, the illusion of complexity in the secondary, enough variety to throw people off, which we've seen. Like there were days early in OTAs where, like we talked about it, like Dominique Hampton, it looks like man coverage, 100% man. They get to Tampa 2 and Jayden's got to hold the football. You know what I'm saying? Like that's good stuff. Or in the red zone, like we talked about, it looks like quarters. They stem to 2. It's just enough of a little bit of a change up and we get a big play out of it as a defense because we got a pick, right? Like that's ultimately what you're looking for. So I don't know if they're scripting those periods. I think some of those are call-outs, but he already seems to have a feel. I mean, he's worked with Dan for a long time. I'm excited to see the change under Joe Witt. I'm excited to see how he kind of settles in as a play caller. But ultimately, like I trust the principles, right, that you were talking about earlier. Like I trust that process. So I think the defense is going to be good, even if it might look a little bit different.
No doubt about it. I'm excited. It should be fun. Unfortunately, we have to wait 30-something more days. Although it's not that long. Training camp announced yesterday. I guess we're a little over a month away. July 28th is the first practice. And those first couple will be open to fans as well. So should be a fun time in Ashburn, even if it could be 98 degrees with 94% humidity in late July. Practice is at 9 a.m., Logan. So we won the practice time lottery and heat there. So yay, Dan. Good job. All right. That was really cool. That was good stuff. And if you missed any of it, the good news is this is a podcast, so you can rewind and digest it all on your own time as you go throughout your weekend. We'll be back, speaking of defense, early next week with our NFC East divisional position group rankings for linebackers, defensive line, and DBs. So we'll do that coming up on the early podcast next week. And then we have some cool stuff planned over the next few weeks as well. For Logan, I'm Craig. We'll see you next time. If you like what you heard, make sure you subscribe, and see you next week on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.